Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. In these months between Series 2 and Series 3, we're exploring some select topics in the history of the early church. We're also talking about the Fathers' relevance to particular themes that still emerge in the news today. So far, we've discussed social justice, liturgy, abortion, fraternal correction, deaconesses, feast days, the Lord's baptism, and the beginnings of the church in Africa. Today, we turn to the origins of Christian religious life, the acts of the ascetics who experimented with forms of community within the ancient church. And I'm tempted to begin by praising the members of religious orders who have influenced me, who have impressed me, and educated me from the earliest days of my childhood. But I fear that one of them might be listening in. And what if they should be tempted to pride by my praise? What then? I fear I would face the wrath of no less a man than St. Jerome. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, I'll give you some background. Jerome was a 4th century father of the church who lived well into the 5th century. He's most famous for translating the Bible, which he did more than once. In the end, he produced the church's official Latin version called the Vulgate. But Jerome was as famous for his volatile temper as he was for his biblical scholarship. I know I've used the poem before, I'll use it again. God's angry man, his crotchety scholar, was St. Jerome, the great name-caller, who cared not a dime for the laws of libel, and in his spare time translated the Bible. That's how the poet Phyllis McGinley remembered him. Jerome was a terror to heretics like Helvidius, who denied Our Lady's perpetual virginity. Our angry man would first knock these heretics down with arguments, and then heap insults upon their head, insults like, "O thou effeminate soldier!" And he could be just as unsparing with the good guys. He found St. Ambrose annoying, and he accused him not just of plagiarism, but of plagiarizing badly. Jerome was unimpressed by St. John Chrysostom, and he strongly suspected that St. Augustine suffered from disordered pride. So I had better not get on the wrong side of St. Jerome. Well, here's what our man said as he wrote to a young religious woman named Eustochium in 384 AD. "I'm writing to you, Lady Eustochium, to tell you straight off that I'm not going to be praising the virginity you pursue. You won't find any flattery in what I write. A flatterer gives you pretty words, but he's still your enemy. Don't expect any fancy rhetoric where I place you among the angels and tell you how your blessed virginity sets the universe at your feet. No, I don't want you to be proud of your vow. I want you to be afraid. You're carrying gold, so look out for robbers. This life is a race course. We run the race here, but we get our prize somewhere else. You can't set aside fear when there are snakes and scorpions in your path." That's pure Jerome. He couldn't just be nice. We have a fundraising letter from St. Gregory of Nyssa from around the same year, and in it Gregory shows himself to be perfectly capable of flattery and fancy rhetoric. And that's fine. Flattery is not incompatible with sanctity, but not with Jerome's brand of sanctity. And I fear he might be listening in on us today. And it's not just Jerome. We know this because consecrated life has been an important part of the Christian faith since the very beginning. And the Fathers, since the very beginning, approached the matter with fear and trembling. St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, speaks of Christians who consecrated themselves to lifelong virginity and celibacy, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul himself lived this way, as did Jesus before him. Jesus declared that some are called to give themselves entirely to God, apart from married life. Just take a look at Matthew 19:12 and Mark 10, 29 to 30. Later in the first century, consecrated men and women were already a fixture in the church. Both Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch mention them. And indeed, both Clement and Ignatius seem to suggest that consecrated virgins and celibates have an exalted place in the church. But for both men, that's not an occasion of flattery, but rather of fear. Both warn the consecrated not to allow themselves to become proud. Clement said, "Let him who is continent not boast of it. Know that it is another who gives the power of continence." And Ignatius added, "If anyone is able to remain continent to the honor of the flesh of the Lord, let him persistently avoid boasting." By the middle of the 2nd century, consecrated virgins were a distinguishing mark of the Christian church. Justin Martyr made note of the fact around 150 AD, and St. Athenagoras of Athens wrote to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius that he should investigate the church, and that he would find there many among us, both men and women, growing old unmarried, in hope of living in closer communion with God. He did not hesitate to use the word many, polloi, when he spoke of the Christian virgins, widows, and celibates. And even the pagans marveled at the phenomenon. Galen, great physician and Stoic philosopher, had little use for Christian thought, yet he had to admit that the Christians were pretty good at living up to the ideals that philosophers admired. Here's what he said. "So we see that the people who are called Christians take their faith from parables, not argument. And yet, we sometimes see them acting like philosophers, for every day makes it obvious how much they despise death, and we can plainly see how they control themselves in sex. For they have not just men, but even women, who refrain from sexual intercourse all their lives. And they also count certain ones who in self-discipline and self-control have reached a level not beneath that of real philosophers." That's high praise from a man who was as opposed to Christianity on principle as the so-called new atheists are today. In the 2nd century, when Christianity was illegal, he knew Christianity by its most visible elements, its most distinctive elements, the elements that set it apart from paganism. And Galen saw those elements in the lives of consecrated men and women. He saw them there in Rome in the 2nd century, and he noticed the difference. And he couldn't help but admire it, though he didn't want to. He could see them because there were so many of them. One of the first things we need to remember about celibacy and virginity in the early church is that these didn't arise from some rule handed down from some administrative official. Modern people often make that mistake when talking about the subject. The truth is that chastity was a grassroots movement, a groundswell of popular feeling. It had the appeal of rebellion because it defied the pervasive and miserable hookup culture of ancient Rome. But it wasn't primarily a rebellion. It was primarily an act of love. Remember what St. Athenagoras said. Men and women took on the celibate life in hope of living in closer communion with God. And since this groundswell continued from one generation to the next, we can safely conclude that those men and women were not disappointed in their hopes. We can bet that they were happy, and that their happiness was visible even to pagans. It's hard to express how different Christianity was from the pagan world when it came to the idea of celibacy. Perhaps the best way to express it is to say that the pagan world saw celibacy in very much the same way as our modern secular world does. An impossible and unnatural ideal, worthy of sarcasm and snickering. Even the Stoics, whose whole philosophy was based on detachment from worldly desires, thought celibacy was a practical impossibility. It was a nice idea, they concluded, but humanly impossible. Yet Christians seem to be falling over each other in their rush to take vows. Did some of them stumble and break their vows? Of course they did. And men like Jerome were immediately on the scene to insult them, and maybe afterward hear their confessions. Because yes, Christians are sinners, and our early sources tell us that some failed in celibacy, as in every other area of life. But many did not stumble, and their dedication astonished the pagans. It was radical, and it was missionary, because it made a powerful impression. Christians and pagans alike were astonished still more by the freedom enjoyed by those in consecrated life. Yes, they often pledged themselves to lives of service to the church, and yes, that meant obedience to superiors, but this too left them free from the difficult decisions that come with the task of doing good things in the world. Celibacy and voluntary poverty gave consecrated religious a liberty that ordinary people could not have because of obligations to family and business. They were absolutely free for service. They could get the job done. And we can see their service still today in the monuments of that period. For example, it's likely that the Roman catacombs were constructed by men consecrated for the task. They were called the fossores, the diggers, and they were taking a grave risk whenever they went to work, pun intended. The catacombs were underground, but they were an enormous work that could not be hidden away. Tons of dirt and stone were removed from their sites every week, and all this was done at a time when Christianity was illegal. It was a dangerous work, a radical work. It was a missionary work in its way, and it was probably done by religious who were consecrated to their task. Fossore was considered an office of the church. The greatest works of the church, however, were not its tombs, but its institutions of charity. Hospitals, hospices, hostels for travelers, pharmacies, orphanages, soup kitchens, and even trade schools. By the end of the 4th century, these were commonly the domain of religious men and women. In Cappadocia and Caesarea, they were staffed by the monks and nuns who followed the rule of the man who was their bishop, Basil the Great. His campus of charitable works was so vast that it came to be called the New City. It was a city in itself, and it was built up through the labors of hands consecrated for such work. Basil's renewal of the city and the church began with his renewal of religious life. The charities that changed life for the people of Cappadocia, especially the poor, were intended to be an overflow of the prayer of consecrated men and women. And there were many such works in many different places. Many different tasks fell to the religious men and women of the 1st through the 5th centuries. Consecrated virgins, deaconesses, and others showed up in the liturgical rubrics because they had the responsibility for making the liturgy run smoothly and beautifully. In some places, the consecrated were responsible for all liturgical music. They were the voices heard at Mass. In many places, they were the heart and hands as well. In many places, the bishops were always chosen from the ranks of monks and solitaries. The church's works of charity, too, depended upon the freedom and dedication of its consecrated members. They were the ones who took risks in times of persecution and exercised extraordinary acts of charity. This was especially evident in those who, at the time of taking vows, gave all their possessions to the poor. And this is a common detail in the histories of earliest Christianity and in the lives of the saints of that period. When the saint in question came from a wealthy family, that act of renunciation could seem spectacular indeed, and we can understand why it would be memorable to history. This was true, for example, in the case of Basil the Great, who turned his family's country estate into a monastic community. And it was true of Gregory the Great, who did the same thing. It was true of Paulinus and Terasia of Nola. It was true of Marcella of Rome and Paula and Eustochium. It was true of Ambrose of Milan and Melania and so many others. Their acts of renunciation rocked the world in which they lived. Imagine what the news media would say if Bill Gates or Warren Buffett suddenly gave everything away and donned coarse brown garments as Marcella did, and gave their lives to chanting the Psalms, and not in Latin, but in Hebrew. I dare say the folks at TMZ would take notice, as did the town gossips and local historians in the ancient world. Wealth and sex are the topics that feed the professional gossips in every age, and nothing is so startling as the lives of those who demonstrate that these things are not important, at least not in the way the world says they are. Poverty, like chastity, is a witness that's radical and in its way missionary. We have already seen that there were many such men and women who sought communion with God through a life of renunciation, a life of consecration, an ascetic life. In Antioch, in the late 4th century, we know that there were 3,000 consecrated virgins and widows in a city whose population was 250,000. 3,000 celibate women, and that number doesn't include any of the celibate men in the brotherhoods or the hermits who filled the nearby mountain. The theologian John Cavadini has wryly observed that this was hardly the golden age of the theology of marriage. Celibacy became so popular that the Byzantine Empire eventually felt the need to enact laws in order to limit the number of aristocrats entering monasteries. They wanted at least some of the best and brightest to enter government and the diplomatic corps. Some of the best known of these thousands of ascetics were living among the solitaries, men like Anthony of the Desert, and women like Mary of Egypt. But the vast majority were living with others who sought a common life of prayer, study, and the service of charity. The forms of this common life were varied and indeed polymorphous, constantly developing, constantly changing. John Chrysostom grew up in a sort of religious house, living with his mother Anthusa, a consecrated widow, and his aunt Sabiniana, who held an office of service in the Church of Antioch. When he struck out on his own, he formed a vowed brotherhood with some classmates. Eventually, he moved out to Mount Silpius to study in greater solitude. There he kept all-night vigils, standing with his arms outstretched so that he did not fall asleep, and he studied the scriptures by torchlight, committing them to memory. He ate minimally. Eventually his health failed him and he had to leave the mountain, but returning to the city, he returned to a life in a brotherhood. Similar experiments in communal life were going on in every corner of the empire. In Rome, Marcella and her circle of friends were committing themselves to charitable work and the intensive study of the Bible under the direction of Saint Jerome. Their teacher complained that they were taskmasters, slave drivers because of their exegetical questions. They required him to spend late nights in research. He also complained as they surpassed him in skills. While the women sang the Psalms flawlessly in Hebrew, Jerome said, he himself still sounded like a Croatian tourist in the Holy Land. But we've already established that Jerome had a penchant for complaining. Different cultures produced different styles of monasteries. When Basil the Great decided to devote his life to God, he embarked on a tour of places renowned for their asceticism: Palestine, Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. He met with many solitaries and observed their life, but finally returned to Cappadocia to establish a religious community on his family property. It was there that he composed his monastic rule, drawing the best from the different monastic traditions he had encountered. What's striking about Basil's story is that by the middle of the 4th century, there were already so many types of religious life, and they were already so remarkably well developed. So much of the literature that has survived from that period deals explicitly with the conduct of religious life. We have works on consecrated virginity from Cyprian, Methodius, Athanasius, Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine, among others. These were the finest minds of their time, and they thought no subject more worthy of their attention. The forms of religious life, the forms of religious community, would undergo greater development in the centuries to come, through the production of the great books of order, the rule of Pachomius, of Basil, Augustine, Benedict. Among the many aspects of life ordered in the rules was dress. There is ample evidence that consecrated men and women wore distinctive garb from early in the Church's history. The early addresses to virgins all take care to specify the reasons for wearing a veil. Reasons of modesty and poverty, of course, but also reasons of witness. Justin and Tertullian argued that even Christian philosophers should wear the distinctive garb of the pallium. It made good sense. Why, after all, did so many pagans like Galen, Epictetus, Arrian, Marcus Aurelius come to a grudging admiration of Christian life? It wasn't from reading Christian books. They had contempt for Christian books and Christian ideas. It came because they saw men and women they knew to be Christians living differently, living in religious life, and they got the strong impression that there were many polloi of such ascetics. How could they get that impression apart from a distinctive dress, a distinctive garb, a habit? The religious habit was, from earliest times, a radical and missionary witness. Well, the Christians who wore it are now long dead, so it's safe for us to recognize them and praise them. We need not hold back our pretty words and fancy rhetoric. There is no danger now of our speeches puffing them up with pride. And I won't endanger today's religious too much by saying that you are their heirs, and the work they did then, you are doing today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Way of the Fathers. If you did, I ask you to consider making a donation to help us. Our sponsor, CatholicCulture.org, is run by Trinity Communications, a nonprofit organization, so donations are tax-deductible in the United States. Donations can be made by credit card, PayPal, check, or in the form of stock. So please go now to our donation form at CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. And remember, your gift will be matched. We're grateful for anything you can give, and we pray for our benefactors every day. I thank you for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.